My cousin Nate has been serving in the Coast Guard for over 10 years now. He's the no-nonsense type, doesn't exaggerate, doesn't buy into superstitions, and definitely isn't into ghost stories or anything like that. Just a steady, boat-loving guy who appreciates structure and routine. He shared this story with me in the summer of 2022, and I actually had him tell it more than once because it really threw me off. Each time, he recounted it exactly the same. This all took place back in 2017, when he was assigned to a lighthouse called Mattis Rock, located far off the coast of Maine. It's one of those places you can only access by boat or helicopter. The island itself is nothing but rough stone, a single lighthouse, and a small utility building for fuel and tools. No plumbing, no connection to the power grid, and barely any cell reception. The lighthouse runs automatically for the most part, but it still needs hands-on maintenance from time to time, which is why the Coast Guard sends people out there every so often. Normally, it's a one-person post, but the previous year had seen some strange electrical issues, so they decided to send 2 men this time, Nate and a guy named Russell. The first few days were exactly what they expected, windy, dull, and full of routine. They spent daylight hours checking the beacon systems, testing backup power, topping off the diesel tanks, and cleaning off the buildup of salt and rust from the inside metalwork. At night, they kept things simple: reading, eating basic meals, and passing time with card games. The isolation was real, but nothing unusual stood out. Then came the 4th night. Around 2 in the morning, Nate woke up feeling off. He wasn't sick and nothing hurt, but something about the air felt wrong. He described it like the weight in a room right before a thunderstorm, thick and tense, except outside, the sky was clear, quiet, and still. He sat up in bed and looked around. Everything was pitch dark. That's when he realized something was off. The beacon wasn't rotating. Even during maintenance periods, the light was supposed to cast its beam across the water every few seconds. A malfunction like that was serious. Nate got up right away and shook Russell to wake him. The 2 of them climbed the tight spiral staircase to the top of the lighthouse to figure out what was wrong. When they got there, the machinery responsible for rotating the light was still running. The gears were moving, but the light itself had stopped turning. Something was blocking it. They found a large, dark piece of cloth jammed deep inside the rotating assembly. It looked like a blanket, or maybe an old coat, completely soaked and covered in a slimy green substance that smelled like mildew and rotting seaweed. They were baffled. The door had been locked, all the windows sealed, and there was no sign of wind or birds that could have dragged it in. It didn't make any sense. They pulled the cloth out, tossed it into the wind outside, and chalked it up to a strange fluke. Then they went back to bed. But the following night, the same exact thing happened again. Right around 2 in the morning, Nate woke up and saw the beacon was once more not rotating. They climbed back up and again found something stuffed into the mechanism. This time, though, it wasn't the same cloth. It was smaller, looked like an old-fashioned scarf or shawl. It was deep red, frayed at the edges, and soaked with salt water. Tiny sea creatures were still clinging to the fabric, as if it had just been pulled from the ocean. That's when the weirdness stopped feeling random. They rechecked the door locks, the windows, even the supply closet. Everything was still secured. Now they were seriously wondering if someone or something had made its way inside, and if it was purposely trying to interfere with the beacon. Starting that night, they began stacking heavy crates in front of the stairwell as a precaution. After their last checks in the beacon room each evening, they'd make sure to lock both the top hatch and the main entrance downstairs without fail. But on the 7th night, something happened that Nate still won't try to explain. He was lying in bed, trying to drift off, when he heard Russell whispering. It wasn't directed at him, though. It sounded like Russell was speaking to someone, or something, in the corner of the room, muttering strange, fragmented sentences like there was someone actually standing there. Nate sat up and asked him what he was saying. Russell just blinked slowly, clearly disoriented, and said he hadn't said a word. Later that night, Nate woke again to find Russell sitting at the window, quietly staring down at the rocks outside. When Nate asked what he was looking at, Russell told him that the previous night, he thought he'd seen someone standing out there, barely within the range of the beacon's sweep. He said whoever it was seemed to be watching them, and then just vanished as the light swung back around. That's when things started to take a darker turn. Russell's behavior grew more and more off. He stopped sleeping, barely spoke, just sat near the window for hours, eyes locked on the rocks below. Nate asked if he was all right, but all Russell would say were things about hearing noises in the walls or voices coming from the stairwell. On the 9th night, they both heard footsteps. These weren't the usual creaks and groans from wind hitting the tower. These were slow, deliberate steps, one at a time, coming from above, from the direction of the beacon room. Nate turned and saw Russell already standing at the base of the stairs, staring upward, completely still. He asked him if he'd gone up there. Russell didn't move. He just looked back at Nate and said quietly, "No." Then Russell turned to Nate and asked if he had gone up there. But neither of them had moved. They stood in silence, listening, waiting. But the footsteps had stopped. And somehow, the quiet that followed felt even heavier. That night, they dragged a dresser in front of the bedroom door and both slept with knives under their pillows. On the 11th night, they were woken again, this time by the beacon failing once more. When they got to the top of the tower, they found the door to the beacon room wide open. Not slightly ajar, not just unlocked. It had been thrown all the way open, as if someone had kicked it in. Wind howled through the open doorway. Inside, the beacon wasn't just malfunctioning, it had been clearly tampered with. The main bulb had been completely removed and placed upright in the center of the room. That bulb was industrial strength, not the kind of thing you can casually unscrew. It takes real force. Nate just stood there frozen. Russell kept repeating, "Someone did this," over and over. Then Nate felt something cold brush across his back. He spun around, but the room was empty. Russell had gone pale. He pointed toward the wall and whispered that he'd seen a hand come out of the bricks. That was it. They bolted down the stairs and barricaded themselves in the bedroom. Nate didn't sleep at all. Russell sat in the corner, rocking slightly, muttering to someone who wasn't there. At first light, Nate used the emergency satellite phone and called for an early extraction, telling them there'd been a critical equipment issue. The boat arrived later that same day, but here's the part that still gives Nate chills. As they were getting picked up, the crew asked them about the distress signal that had come through at exactly 2:12 that morning. But Nate hadn't made any call. He hadn't even touched the emergency phone until sunrise. According to the deckhand, though, a call had come through sometime during the night, full of static and distortion. They said they could barely make out a voice saying something about someone being there with them. And then the line cut off completely. Russell didn't say a word the entire way back to shore. A few months later, he resigned from the Coast Guard without much of an explanation, and as far as Nate knows, he's never talked to anyone about what really happened on that lighthouse. Nate still does occasional maintenance assignments, but he's made it clear he'll never return to Mattis Rock. This next part took place during the COVID lockdowns. It was that stage when people were restless and burnt out from being stuck indoors all the time. I was single then, spending my nights flipping through Tinder or messaging people while watching whatever was on Netflix. It felt like that's all anyone was doing at the time. One night, I started chatting with a girl I'd followed on Instagram for a while. Her name's Sophia. She usually goes by Soph. We both live in Suffolk County, Long Island, maybe a 20 to 30-minute drive from the Hamptons and about an hour out from Montauk. We were both bored and eventually agreed to meet up. She lived just 5 minutes away, so I drove over to pick her up. We ended up going for a drive to a local park that was technically closed at the time and just hung out drinking a couple of White Claws. Right away, I picked up on her vibe, kind of bold and carefree in a fun way. She was totally fine with hopping fences or walking into places we weren't supposed to be. There was this natural chemistry between us, and maybe 45 minutes in, she suggested we head out to Montauk to walk the cliffs by the Lighthouse. The grounds around the Lighthouse were off limits after dark, possibly even fully closed because of lockdown rules. But I didn't care. That kind of spontaneous adventure sounded like exactly what I needed. So we finished our drinks, got back in the car, and drove all the way east to Montauk Point. When we got there, she told me to just pull into the Lighthouse parking lot. I was a little unsure about that, didn't feel right parking there after hours, but she was totally unfazed. Said there wouldn't be any security out here on a Tuesday night during the off-season, especially with everything shut down for the pandemic. And honestly, she wasn't wrong. There were no other cars anywhere, not even in the distance. She mentioned she'd come out here before, even back before COVID, so I figured she knew what she was talking about. We cracked open another White Claw and just sat in the lot for a bit. I kept glancing around, checking for any sign of security, but she kept brushing it off, telling me to chill. Eventually, we got out and started walking toward the lighthouse. Seeing it up close at night was wild. It's such an impressive structure, towering over you like that in the dark. But there's also something about it that feels off. Not in a bad way, just eerie, like you're somewhere you shouldn't be. That kind of quiet, in-between atmosphere you can't really put into words. Soph didn't take us in through the main entrance. She led us slightly off to the side, so we wouldn't walk directly under any lights or risk being seen. This was my first time ever at the Montauk Lighthouse, so I just followed her lead. She brought us right to the cliffside path that runs behind the lighthouse, where all the rocks form this trail people call the Cliff Walk. There weren't any lights on along the trail that night, just a few near the front gate and the main lighthouse beam itself, so we used our flashlights to find our way. As we were moving slowly across the rocks, watching our footing, Soph, who was now walking just behind me, suddenly said my name. I turned around and she was shining her flashlight behind her towards something in the dark. There was someone else out there, down on the rocks with us. When we both pointed our lights in his direction, we could see him more clearly. He had a hood pulled up over his head, and from what we could see, he looked like a black guy, but it was too dark to tell his age or really anything else about him. I called out, asking if he worked there, half hoping he was some kind of park staff or security guard. He didn't answer, and he wasn't moving either. Just stood there watching us. Trying to play it safe, I said, "Hey, we're just heading out, sorry." I was nervous. Figured if he was with security, we might get in trouble for trespassing or something. But then, out of nowhere, he spoke. He asked, "Y'all want to buy some Coke?" That's when it hit me. He wasn't security. He was just some random guy hanging around the rocks at night. And that somehow made things feel even worse. It wasn't relief. It was this tightening feeling in my chest, like we shouldn't be there at all. I told him, "Nah, we're good," and motioned for Soph to keep walking. I let her take the lead and stayed just a step behind her as we moved forward. But then he started walking too. He didn't say anything else, didn't press the offer or make small talk. He just moved, silent and steady, keeping the same distance behind us no matter how fast or slow we walked. I kept checking over my shoulder with the flashlight, and every time I did, he was still there, keeping pace. The whole atmosphere shifted. What had started as a laid-back, slightly rebellious adventure now felt tense and uncomfortable. We finally made it to the end of the cliff walk and cut through the grass toward the parking lot. But he was still behind us, same pace, same distance, and then we heard him call out again. He asked, "Where are you going?" At that point, it was obvious. He wasn't just a random guy offering something and moving on. He was following us with intention. I didn't answer and quietly told Soph not to either. We kept moving quickly, side by side, eyes forward. That's when we noticed two more men approaching from the other side, also coming up behind us. I knew instinctively not to run. That would have escalated everything. One of the other guys yelled something at us too, but I couldn't make out what he said. We didn't stop to find out. We made it to the car and jumped in as fast as we could. The moment we shut the doors, both Soph and I let out a scream. The three guys had closed in. They were right up against the car. I hit the lock button immediately, and I swear it was just seconds before two of them started trying the handles on either side. I threw the car into reverse, really the only way I could back out without risking hitting anyone, and just got us out of there. As I reversed, they started kicking the sides and smacking the windows, but they didn't try to follow once we were moving. On the drive back, both of us were rattled. Neither of us said much at first, and when the adrenaline finally wore off, we sat there in silence. I dropped her off soon after and we called it a night. We ended up hanging out quite a few times after that and still keep in touch to this day. But even now, that night stays with me. It felt like we just narrowly avoided something that could have gone very wrong. Some of my friends think it might have been a gang, maybe Crips. I don't know who they were, but whatever that situation was, I've had zero desire to go back out to Montauk at night again. My name's Gregory, and that story came from my old friend Ian, one he's told me many times over the years. It happened to him quite a while back, and I recently asked if he could write it all out so I could share it. He gave me the green light. I've always found it deeply unsettling. Ian's one of those guys you meet once and know he's the real thing. In his 50s now, solid build, sun-worn skin from years working around saltwater. He spent decades in marine salvage and coastal repair work. If something broke near the ocean, Ian was usually the one called in to fix it. But he wasn't just a contractor. He'd been a diver, a ship systems tech, and even did government inspections in remote coastal areas. This guy had seen it all over the years, so when he shared this story with me, I didn't question it for a second. According to Ian, it happened back in 2013, when he was hired by a small county up in Washington state to do a structural inspection on an old, decommissioned lighthouse. The county had taken ownership of the property years earlier, but had no clue what to do with it. Some developers wanted to tear it down, some preservationists wanted to save it, but no one wanted to pay for either option. Ian's task was straightforward: head out there solo, check the place top to bottom, and determine if it was even worth restoring. The lighthouse sat on a remote, rocky island, about an hour by boat from the mainland. The island itself wasn't much, just a patch of rock and dirt, roughly 300 feet across. Besides the lighthouse, there was only an old generator shed and the remains of some rusted scaffolding from back in the day. It hadn't been active in years, and it certainly wasn't a spot people visited. There weren't even proper docks, just a ledge barely big enough for a small Coast Guard boat to offload someone during high tide. Ian packed light. Enough food for 4 days, a sleeping bag, tools, a clipboard, and a two-way marine radio. The plan was easy. Get dropped off Monday, complete a full inspection by Wednesday, and call for pickup on Thursday afternoon. He didn't think twice about going out there alone. Jobs like this were his bread and butter. He'd done plenty of similar assignments before. When he first arrived, everything was exactly how he expected. Quiet, overcast, chilly. The place had that familiar scent of salt air, rusted metal, and general decay, typical of abandoned coastal buildings. The lighthouse itself stood about 50 feet tall, built sometime in the early 1900s. Inside, it had the usual narrow spiral staircase winding up to the beacon room at the top. The glass lens up in the beacon hadn't been functional in years, but structurally, the lighthouse was still in good shape. Ian went through his usual inspection routine, checking support beams, making sure the stairs were sound, testing the window frames. The floor on the ground level was warped, but still walkable. The second floor had once been used for storage. Now it was just an empty space with a few rusted metal cabinets pushed off to the side. The third floor contained a tiny sleeping area, clearly untouched for decades. Instead of using that room, Ian set up his sleeping bag on the ground floor, near the old generator room. It was more sheltered from the wind and held a bit of warmth compared to the upper levels. That first night passed without incident. But Ian remembered thinking how unusually quiet everything was. He told me you don't realize how much ambient noise the world has until it's all stripped away. There were no birds, no insects, not even the steady rhythm of waves hitting the rocks outside, just the occasional soft gust of wind, and even that sounded distant. By the time he woke up on the second day, a thick fog had rolled in. Peering outside, he could barely see 5 feet past the window. It was like staring into a white wall. He said it wasn't just any fog. It looked dense, almost like something you could reach out and touch. Still, that part of the coast was known for heavy fog, so he didn't think too much of it. He spent most of the day working on the upper stairwell, taking measurements and writing notes. That's when he noticed something strange. About halfway up the stairs to the beacon room, there was a maintenance closet built into the wall. On the first day, he'd tried opening it, but the hinges were so rusted and stuck that it wouldn't budge. Now, though, it was slightly open, not much, just about an inch, but clearly enough to see that it had been moved. Ian figured maybe the humidity had caused it to shift on its own. Still, it gave him a weird feeling. Inside, the closet was pitch black. He pushed the door open farther and noticed something tucked into the back corner, a small wooden box about the size of a lunchbox. It was covered in damp green moss, looked like it had been submerged in water not too long ago. He chose not to open it. Instead, he closed the closet door and made a note to include it in his final report. That night, something woke him, but it wasn't from a specific noise. It was the lack of sound that did it. He said it felt like the world had gone still, like everything. Wind, waves, even the creaks of the old building had suddenly gone quiet. Then he heard footsteps. They were faint, metallic, echoing from the stairwell above him. At first, he thought maybe a raccoon or some other animal had gotten in. But after a moment, he realized the steps weren't coming down. They were going up. Whatever was moving inside the lighthouse was climbing the stairs. Ian grabbed his flashlight and aimed it at the stairwell entrance, just waiting. But nothing came into view. Eventually, the footsteps stopped, and the silence returned. The following morning, he did a full sweep of the building, top to bottom, every floor, every closet. He even made his way up to the roof to check for loose panels or signs of nesting animals. But there was nothing. No wildlife, no intruders, nothing disturbed, except for the box. It was no longer in the closet. Now it was sitting partway into the stairwell just outside the closet door, still covered in moss. Ian stood there for a long time, just staring at it, trying to figure out how it got there, or who might have moved it. Eventually, he picked it up. It was heavier than he'd expected. The wood was swollen from moisture, and the lid was sealed, nailed shut, tight. He didn't want to pry it open or damage it, so he set it down at the base of the stairs and stepped outside to clear his head. That's when he saw something else that didn't make sense. There were footprints in the mud surrounding the lighthouse, not boot prints or shoe treads, bare feet. He followed the trail with his eyes. The prints came from the north side of the lighthouse and led straight to the edge of the cliff. Then they stopped. No return trail. No disturbance in the brush. Just 10, maybe 12 clear, wet footprints leading to a sheer drop into the sea. He stood there for a long while, trying to make sense of it, trying to come up with any explanation that didn't feel worse than the mystery itself. Maybe someone had made it onto the island somehow, but as far as Ian knew, the only boat scheduled was the one coming to pick him up, and that wasn't due until the next day. He thought about using the radio to request an early extraction, but the fog had rolled in so thick that it was unlikely anyone could safely navigate back through it. So he went back inside, locked every door and hatch he could, and then jammed the stairwell shut, using a length of iron pipe he'd brought in from outside. He tried to get some sleep, but that night turned out to be the worst one yet. Around 1:30 in the morning, he heard the door to the beacon room slam shut. Hard, so hard, that dust shook loose from the ceiling above him. Then came the knocking, 3 slow, deliberate knocks, coming not from the front door, not from a window, but from the inside wall of the tower itself. It was like someone was just behind the plaster, tapping their knuckles gently on the brick from within. Ian didn't move. He lay still in his sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, barely breathing, waiting for the sound to stop. Eventually, it did. At first light, he checked the lighthouse again. This time, the wooden box was gone, and the closet, the one that had been sealed shut on the first day, was now wide open. That was it. He knew without a doubt he wasn't the only one on that island. Ian went straight to the marine radio and called in an urgent pickup. He claimed a medical issue to ensure they'd take it seriously. The fog hadn't lifted, but the operator said they'd try to get a boat to him within a few hours. He packed up his gear and waited near the small stone ledge where the drop-off had happened days earlier. The fog never let up, in fact it thickened. He sat there for nearly 7 hours, barely able to see beyond arm's reach. The sun dipped low, the temperature dropped, and everything around him went quiet again. Then he heard footsteps, crunching through the gravel behind him, near the base of the lighthouse. He turned, but saw no one. Maybe there was nothing there. Or maybe he just couldn't see whoever it was through the fog. He backed away toward the cliff's edge and stayed there, scanning the gray until he finally heard the faint, low sound of a boat horn in the distance. They reached him just after nightfall. When Ian was finally pulled onto the boat, one of the deckhands looked at him and asked why he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Ian didn't go into detail. He just told them the lighthouse was unsafe and should be sealed off. Back at the office, he submitted a short report. In it, he wrote that the structure was compromised and not suitable for further access. But he left out the part about the footsteps and the box. He later told me he didn't mention those things because, at the time, he genuinely wondered if the isolation had gotten to him, that maybe his mind had started to slip after being alone for too long. That was pretty much the last part of what Ian had written down for me. He never returned to that lighthouse. Over the next few months, he wrapped up the rest of his active projects and gradually pulled himself away from field work. Within a year, he'd stopped taking on contracts altogether. Told people he was shifting focus to work that didn't involve going out to remote sites anymore, staying on dry land. Anytime someone asked if his decision had anything to do with the lighthouse, he'd just shrug and say he'd seen enough out there. I only pushed him about it once, asked him what he really thought happened on that island. He looked right at me, calm, serious, and said something I still think about to this day. Some places are meant to be left alone. They just need time and silence. That was all he'd offer. I eventually tried to do some digging on my own, tried to learn more about the lighthouse he described. But the coordinates Ian had written down didn't match up with any recorded structure. County documents vaguely referenced a decommissioned tower somewhere off the coast, but there was no name listed, no official history, nothing public at all. It was like he'd never been there, like the place never even existed. And honestly, that's the part that still unsettles me the most. Not just what Ian told me, but what no one else ever has. I don't know if I want to believe Ian really was just losing his grip out there, or if the truth is something far stranger.